The wind howled through the pines like a wounded animal, rattling the shutters of the lonely cabin perched on the edge of the wilderness. Inside, Ethan sat by the fire, his rough hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee gone cold long ago. The flames flickered, casting shadows that danced across the walls that had once echoed with laughter but now held only silence. 2 years had passed since fever took his Elizabeth, and though the seasons had turned, his grief remained as constant as the mountains in the distance. Outside, the storm grew fiercer, snow piling in drifts against the door. He should have been used to the harsh winters by now, but this one felt heavier, as if the very air mourned with him. The wind screamed again, and for a moment, he thought he heard something else beneath it, a sound too sharp, too human to be the storm. He stilled, listening. There it was again, a knock, weak but insistent. Frowning, he rose, his joints stiff from the cold even near the fire. Who would be out in this? Traders had long since holed up in town, and the nearest homestead was miles away. He unlatched the door, and the wind nearly tore it from his grip. Snow swirled in, stinging his face, but what made his breath catch was the sight before him. A woman, her cloak thin and dusted with ice, stood hunched against the cold, her arms clutching a bundled infant to her chest. Behind her, 2 small children clung to her skirts, their faces pale with hunger, their eyes too wide for faces so young. The woman swayed, her lips blue at the edges. "Please," she whispered, the word barely audible over the storm. We can't go farther." For a heartbeat, Ethan hesitated. Letting strangers in was a risk. Food was scarce, and winter had no mercy for the unprepared. But then the little girl at the woman's side looked up at him, her lower lip trembling, and he saw the same helpless fear he'd seen in Elizabeth's eyes when the fever burned too hot to bear. Without a word, he stepped aside, ushering them into the warmth. The woman Mary, she said her name, was sank onto the stool by the hearth like her legs could no longer hold her. The children huddled close, their gazes darting between Ethan and the fire, as if unsure which was more dangerous. He moved quietly, ladling stew from the pot that had been simmering since morning, filling bowls until steam rose in curls. He handed the first to the boy, James, who stared at it like he'd forgotten what hot food looked like. The little girl, Emma, clutched hers with both hands, blowing on it like she'd been taught, though her fingers shook. Mary fed the baby Henry first, her own bowl untouched until he was settled, his whimpers fading into sleepy sighs. Ethan watched them, the way their shoulders slowly relaxed, the way the firelight softened the sharp edges of their hunger. He should ask questions where they'd come from, why they were alone in this weather, but the words stuck in his throat. Some truths could wait until the storm passed. For now, there was only this, the crackle of the fire, the quiet sounds of spoons scraping bowls, and the strange, fragile sense that for the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel quite so empty. Outside, the wind wailed on, but inside, the hearth burned bright against the dark. The storm raged through the night, its fury unrelenting, as if the very earth resisted the intrusion of warmth and light within Ethan's cabin. Snow piled high against the walls, sealing them in like a tomb, but inside, the fire held steady, its glow painting the faces of the strangers who had stumbled into his solitude. Mary sat stiffly on the edge of the stool, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as though afraid to take up too much space. The children, exhausted from cold and hunger, had curled together on a makeshift pallet near the hearth, their breathing slow, and even all but baby Henry, who fussed softly against his mother's shoulder. Ethan busied himself with the tasks he knew best: feeding the fire, refilling the kettle, checking the latch on the door, anything to avoid the weight of the silence between them. He was a man accustomed to quiet, but this was different. This quiet was alive with unspoken questions, with the ghosts of stories not yet told. Finally, he cleared his throat and nodded toward the children. "They sleep deep," he said, his voice rough from disuse. Mary's gaze flickered to him, wary as a doe scenting the wind. "They ain't had a safe night's rest in weeks," she admitted, so low he almost didn't catch it. She shifted Henry in her arms, rocking him gently. "Neither have I." Ethan studied her, then the hollows beneath her eyes, the way her fingers trembled even as they clutched her son. This was more than weariness. This was the kind of tired that sank into bones, the kind that came from running too long with no place left to run. He knew that tired. He'd seen it in his own reflection after Elizabeth was gone. The wind howled, rattling the shutters, and little Emma stirred in her sleep, whimpering. Mary was on her feet in an instant, settling back beside her daughter, smoothing her hair with a touch so tender it made Ethan's chest ache. He turned away, pretending to adjust the fire, but not before he saw the way Mary's shoulders hunched, the way her breath hitched like she was holding back something too heavy to name. "You ain't got to tell me nothing," he said after a while, staring into the flames. "But if you're fixing to stay till this storm passes, I ought to know if there's trouble following you." The silence stretched, thick and uneasy. Then, so soft he almost missed it, Mary spoke. "My husband left us." The words were flat, drained of anger, as if she'd repeated them too many times to feel them anymore. "Said he was going for supplies back in autumn. Never came back." She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the edge of her shawl. "When the food ran out, I packed what we had and started walking. Thought maybe we'd find a town, or somebody who'd take pity." Her voice broke then just a little, like ice cracking underfoot. "Didn't reckon on the storm." Ethan didn't answer right away. He'd known men like that, men who took the easy path, no matter who it buried. The thought of a woman and 3 little ones left to face the wilderness alone sat bitter in his gut. He poked at the fire, sending up a shower of sparks. "You're welcome here," he said at last. "Long as you need." Mary's head snapped up, her eyes searching his face, as if she expected to find some trick in his words. But there was none, just the plain truth, offered without flourish. For the first time since she'd crossed his threshold, something in her posture eased. "Thank you," she whispered, and the words hung between them, fragile as the flame trembling in the lantern's glass. Outside, the storm raged on. But in the hearth's glow, something new flickered, not quite trust, not yet, but the first faint ember of hope. The storm surrendered after 3 days, its fury spent, leaving behind a world transformed. Sunlight spilled over the snow-blanketed clearing, so bright it hurt the eyes, and the trees stood motionless under skies of aching blue. The sudden stillness felt unnatural after the wind's ceaseless howling, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of wood smoke and simmered beans, of damp wool drying by the fire, of the faint milky sweetness that clung to baby Henry. Mary moved through the space with quiet efficiency, sweeping the floor with a broom made of bundled twigs, smoothing the blankets on the children's pallet. She worked like someone who had spent a lifetime making do, every motion purposeful, nothing wasted. Ethan watched from the corner of his eye as he mended a harness at the table, the leather stiff under his fingers. He wasn't used to sharing his space, to the rustle of skirts or the murmur of voices that weren't his own. The sounds should have chafed, but instead they settled around him like a quilt he hadn't realized he'd been missing. James, the boy, hovered near the door, peering out at the glittering whiteness with undisguised longing. "Can we go out?" he blurted suddenly, rocking on his toes. I haven't seen proper snow since," he cut himself off, shooting a glance at his mother. Mary's hands stilled on the blanket she was folding. "James," she said, a warning threading through the single word. Ethan set down the awl. "Reckon some air would do him good," he said mildly. "Long as they're bundled proper." He stood, retrieving his own coat from its peg, then hesitated before taking down Elizabeth's old wool wrap, the one that had hung untouched since the last winter she'd seen. He held it out to Emma. The girl stared at it, her small face unreadable, then reached out to touch the fabric with something like reverence. Mary's breath caught, just slightly, but she only nodded. "Mind your step," she told James as he scrambled into his boots. "Snow's deeper than you." Ethan showed the boy how to test the drifts with a stick, how to watch for hidden branches beneath the white. James listened with solemn attention, his nose already going pink in the cold. Behind them, Emma moved through the snow like a little ghost, making careful footprints, her small frame swallowed in Elizabeth's wrap. Ethan's throat tightened watching her, but the ache was different now, not the raw grief of before, but something softer, something that left room to breathe. Back inside, Mary had Henry cradled in one arm while she stirred the pot with the other. The firelight caught the fine bones of her face, the stubborn set of her jaw. She looked up as they entered, her gaze flickering over Emma in the borrowed wrap, but she said nothing. Not then. It wasn't until evening, when the children were asleep and the cabin was quiet save for the crackle of the fire, that she spoke. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly, staring into the flames. "Give her that wrap." Ethan ran a hand over the rough wood of the table. "Ain't doing nobody any good hanging there," he said. And that was all. But in the silence that followed, something shifted between them, not spoken, not even fully acknowledged, but they're all the same. Outside, the first stars pricked through the black velvet of the sky. The snow would melt soon. The world would turn toward spring. But here, in the warm circle of the hearth, something new had taken root, tentative, fragile, but alive. Winter's grip on the land weakened day by day, its icy fingers pried loose by a sun that grew bolder with each dawn. The snow receded in ragged patches, revealing frozen earth beneath, then mud, then the first brave spikes of green pushing through the softening soil. Icicles wept themselves away from the cabin's eaves, their steady drip marking time like a slow, patient clock. Inside, the air no longer carried winter's sharp bite. Instead, it held the close warmth of bodies living in harmony, of breath and movement and quiet industry woven together through shared days. Ethan found himself rising earlier now, not to the hollow silence of an empty cabin but to the low murmur of Mary already at work banking the fire, grinding coffee, humming fragments of old songs under her breath as she moved. The sound wrapped around him like the steam from his morning cup, familiar in a way that startled him when he paused to notice. He'd forgotten this, the way a home could feel alive even in its quietest moments. James shadowed him like a second shadow, his endless questions bouncing between the barn and the woodpile. The boy's hands were quick to learn, his eyes missing nothing as Ethan showed him how to mend a fence post or steady a skittish horse. There was a hunger in him not just for knowledge, but for something deeper, something Ethan recognized from his own boyhood. Approval. The solid weight of a man's presence, where before there had been only absence. Emma, quieter but no less watchful, had claimed a corner of the hearth as her own, arranging and rearranging a collection of smooth stones Mary had washed for her. Sometimes Ethan would catch her whispering to them, her small face solemn as she acted out some private drama. Other times she'd sit at his elbow as he worked, her presence as light and constant as sunlight through glass. She never asked for anything, this little girl, but her eyes spoke volumes when she thought no one was looking, especially when they lingered on the wooden doll Ethan had whittled for her during the long evenings, its face still rough and unfinished beneath his knife. Mary moved through it all like the steady heartbeat of their strange, new family. She mended clothes without being asked, knew when to press a cool hand to Henry's forehead before the rest of them noticed his feverish flush, and somehow always had bread rising when the last loaf ran low. There was a quiet magic in her confidence, in the way she could make a meal stretch further or find the exact right word to soothe James's stormy moods. One evening, as the last light bled from the sky, Ethan found her standing at the cabin's small window, Henry asleep against her shoulder. She didn't turn when he approached, but her posture shifted just slightly in invitation. Together they watched James and Emma chasing fireflies in the gathering dusk, their laughter floating through the open door like music. "They look like they belong here," Mary said softly, and the words hung between them, heavy with unspoken possibility. Ethan studied the way the fading light caught the curve of her cheek, the way Henry's tiny fist curled trustingly in her shawl. He thought of the empty years behind him and the fragile hope taking root in his chest. "Maybe they do," he said at last. And for the first time since Elizabeth's passing, the future didn't loom before him like a door he couldn't bear to open. Outside, the first frogs of spring began their evening chorus, their voices rising from the thawing earth like a promise. Inside, the fire burned low and steady, its glow painting the walls with the warm hues of a heart beginning to heal. The greening world carried with it a deceptive peace, as if nature herself had conspired to lull them into believing the worst was behind them. The fields sprouted tender shoots under Mary's careful tending. James's laughter rang through the barn as he helped Ethan mend the plow, and Emma's collection of river-smooth stones now lined the cabin's windowsill like silent sentinels. Even baby Henry had grown sturdy, his once pale cheeks now round with health as he practiced sitting up on a quilt spread across the floor. The rhythm of their days had settled into something so natural, so unthinking, that Ethan sometimes caught himself forgetting this hadn't always been his life, that there had been years of hollow silence before Mary and the children blew in with the winter storm. It was on one such golden afternoon, with the scent of fresh-turned earth thick in the air, that the fragile illusion shattered. Ethan was repairing the chicken coop's sagging roof when James's voice cut through the quiet sharper, tighter than he'd ever heard it. "Mama." The word carried a warning that sent Ethan's hand instinctively toward the rifle leaning against the fence post before he'd even turned to look. A stranger stood at the edge of the clearing, his silhouette sharp against the new-leafed trees. Even at a distance, Ethan could see the man's fine coat was travel-stained, his boots caked with mud from hard riding. But it was the way Mary froze, her hands clutching Henry so tightly the baby whimpered, that told Ethan everything he needed to know. "Thomas." Mary's voice was barely audible, but the name landed like a stone in still water, rippling outward to where Emma stood clutching her doll by the garden fence. The girl's face went ashen, her small body tensed to flee. The man Thomas took a step forward, his mouth curving into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "There's my family," he said, spreading his arms wide as if expecting them to run into his embrace. When no one moved, his expression hardened.
"Mary,
you look comfortable." His gaze swept over the thriving homestead, the well-tended fields, lingering on Ethan with cold assessment. Ethan moved then, positioning himself between Thomas and where Mary stood rooted to the spot. "This is private land," he said, his voice carefully neutral even as every muscle in his body coiled tight. Thomas's laugh was a dry, unpleasant sound. "Is it now?" He rocked back on his heels, thumbs hooked in his belt. "See, I thought my wife and children might be missing me. Came all this way to collect them." His eyes locked onto Mary over Ethan's shoulder. "You ready to come home, darlin'?" Mary's breath came fast and shallow, but when she spoke, her voice held steady. "We have a home." The silence that followed was electric. Thomas's smile vanished, replaced by something darker, more dangerous. Ethan had seen that look before on men who couldn't stand to lose, not even what they'd thrown away themselves. "Well now," Thomas said softly, taking a deliberate step back. "We'll see about that."
He tipped his hat mockingly.
"Be seeing you soon." As his figure disappeared into the trees, the spell broke. James rushed to his mother's side, his young face twisted with fear he was too proud to let become tears. Emma remained frozen by the fence, her doll dangling forgotten from one hand. Only Henry, too young to understand, babbled happily in Mary's arms. Ethan turned to meet Mary's gaze. The color had drained from her face, but her jaw was set, her shoulders squared. In her eyes, Ethan saw not just fear, but something fiercer, the determination of a woman who'd already survived abandonment and wouldn't let her children be torn from the first real safety they'd known. The shadows lengthened around them as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Somewhere in the woods, a nightingale began its evening song, oblivious to the storm gathering in human hearts. Inside the cabin, the fire would need tending soon, but for now they stood together in the gathering dusk, a family forged in hardship, facing the first true test of the fragile life they'd built. The peace of spring had been beautiful while it lasted. Dawn came reluctantly, a pale gray light seeping through the cabin's single window, like water through cloth. Ethan had spent the night in the rocking chair by the cold hearth, his rifle across his knees, watching the door as if it might burst inward at any moment. Mary had pretended to sleep, but he'd seen the way her fingers clutched the quilt edge, the way her breath hitched whenever the wind rattled the shutters. The children had finally succumbed to exhaustion. James curled protectively around Emma on their pallet, the girl's face still streaked with dried tears, while Henry slept oblivious in the crook of Mary's arm. The first true birdsong of morning found Ethan saddling his horse, his movement stiff from the long vigil. Mary appeared in the barn doorway, her shawl pulled tight against the morning chill. Henry balanced on her hip. "You're going to town," she said flatly. It wasn't a question. Ethan tightened the saddle cinch with more force than necessary. "Sheriff needs to know what we're dealing with." He kept his voice low, though James still slept inside. "Man like that, he'll have a history." Mary's fingers worried the edge of Henry's blanket. "And if the law says he has rights?" The words hung between them, sharp as the axe blade leaning against the barn wall. Ethan met her gaze then, seeing not just the fear but the steel beneath it. "Then we'll know what we're up against." He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture that felt suddenly inadequate. "Keep the rifle close." The ride to town passed in a blur of greening fields and mud-slick trails. The sheriff's office smelled of coffee and gun oil, the man himself hunched over paperwork at his cluttered desk. He listened without interruption as Ethan laid out the situation, his weathered face giving nothing away until the mention of Thomas's name. Tall fellow, fancy talker but mean eyes. The sheriff leaned back in his chair with a creak of leather. "He blew through here last fall, owing half the merchants in town. Took up with a widow woman over by Miller's Creek, left her high and dry too." He tapped a finger against the wanted notices piled to one side. "Got a brother with a spread down south. Reckon that's where he's been licking his wounds." Ethan's hands curled into fists without his meaning them to. "He claims rights to the children." The sheriff sighed, rubbing at the bridge of his nose. "Law says a man's got claim to his blood, less he's proven unfit." He held up a hand at Ethan's expression. "But abandonment's a serious charge, especially with winter coming on." He pushed his feet, reaching for his hat. "Best I ride out with you. See this settled proper." The sun was high by the time they returned, its light glinting off the rifle barrel resting across Mary's lap as she sat vigil on the cabin porch. The children clustered around her like ducklings, James standing guard at her shoulder, Emma peering out from behind her skirts, even Henry unusually solemn in her arms. Thomas emerged from the tree line as if summoned, his horse skittish from the sheriff's presence. "This ain't your concern, lawman," he called, though his easy grin didn't quite mask the tension in his frame. The sheriff dismounted slowly, deliberately. "Heard you been telling folks you're owed a family, Thomas." His voice carried the quiet authority of a man used to being obeyed. "Also heard you walked away from that family when winter was coming on." Thomas's smile turned venomous. "A man's got a right to change his mind. Not when children's lives hang in the balance." The sheriff stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on his pistol. "Now, I can haul you in for the debts you left in town, or you can ride out now and not look back." His gaze flickered to where Mary sat stone-faced on the porch. "Choice is yours." For a long moment, the clearing held its breath. Then Thomas spat into the dirt, his eyes locking onto Mary with a promise of unfinished business. But when he wheeled his horse around, the sheriff's voice stopped him cold. "One more thing." The lawman's tone could have frozen fire. "You set foot on this land again, I'll see you in irons. That's a promise." As Thomas's figure disappeared in a cloud of dust, the tension didn't so much break as settle like snow after a storm, covering but not erasing what lay beneath. The sheriff tipped his hat to Mary before mounting up. "You folks have a good day now." Night fell softly that evening, the children's laughter tentative at first, then gaining strength as the reality of their safety sank in. Mary's hands trembled only slightly as she lit the evening lamp, the flame catching in her eyes as she looked across the table at Ethan. No words passed between them, but none were needed. Outside, the first fireflies of summer blinked their silent Morse code against the gathering dark. Inside, the hearth fire burned steady and bright, its light holding the shadows at bay for now, and with care, perhaps for all the nights to come. The summer sun hung golden over the homestead, gilding the rows of corn that stood tall in Mary's garden and setting the freshly whitewashed fence posts aglow. The air hummed with cicadas and the contented clucking of hens pecking in the yard, while from the open barn door came the rhythmic sound of James whistling as he brushed down Ethan's mare. Inside the cabin, the smell of rising bread and wild berry jam sweetened every breath, mingling with the faint scent of pine from the new floorboards Ethan had laid just last week. Mary stood at the hearth, her hands dusted with flour as she shaped the day's loaves, her movements sure and unhurried. At her feet, Henry played with wooden blocks Ethan had carved for him, the baby's delighted giggles ringing out each time his tower toppled. Emma sat cross-legged nearby, her serious little face intent as she stitched careful rows on the doll's dress. Mary had helped her cut from scrap fabric the same doll whose face Ethan had finally finished carving with painstaking care, giving it Emma's same wide, watchful eyes. Ethan paused in the doorway, his arms full of firewood, letting the scene before him settle into his bones. There was a rightness to it. This life they'd built together, not the life he'd imagined all those lonely years ago, but something richer, fuller. The kind of life that grew from second chances and stubborn hope. As if sensing his presence, Mary turned, flowers streaking her cheekbone, her smile blooming slow and sweet as sunrise. "You're just in time," she said, nodding toward the table where a simple wreath of wildflowers lay beside a length of faded blue ribbon. "Emma's been waiting to crown you proper." Ethan set down the wood, his calloused fingers suddenly awkward as Emma approached, her small hands lifting the wreath with ceremonial gravity. He bent his head to let her place it atop his sun-bleached hair, the flower's fragile perfume surrounding him. James appeared in the doorway then, his face flushed from his chores, a matching wreath clutched in his hand. "For Mama," he said, uncharacteristically shy as Mary knelt to accept his offering. The boy's throat worked as she kissed his forehead, his adolescent pride warring with a childlike need to cling to this moment, this safety, this love. Later, when the bread was baked and shared, when Henry had been rocked to sleep and Emma's doll tucked in beside her, Ethan found Mary on the porch, her face turned toward the star-strewn sky. He came to stand beside her, their shoulders not quite touching, the silence between them as comfortable as old wool. "Elizabeth would be glad," he said at last, the words quiet but sure. "That you're here. That the children." His voice roughened, but Mary's hand found his in the dark, her fingers threading through his with a certainty that needed no words. The night breathed around them, alive with cricket song and the whisper of wind through the corn. Somewhere beyond the meadow, a fox barked, and closer by, an owl called to its mate. Ordinary sounds, everyday miracles. Inside, the hearth fire burned low, its embers pulsing like a steady heartbeat. Outside, under the endless sky, two figures stood side by side, their shadows merging into one against the moonlit earth. A family found, a life begun anew. The end. If this story of resilience and redemption touched your heart, subscribe for more tales of frontier courage and quiet love. Let us know in the comments which moment moved you most. Was it Ethan's first act of kindness, Mary's quiet strength, or the children finding their forever home? Your engagement helps bring more of these heartfelt stories to life. Click subscribe and never miss a journey back to the hearth of human connection.